Somewhere, special memories are waiting for you.
Somewhere between a smile and a laugh.
Somewhere your dreams can come true.
Somewhere between the sky and the sea, between the night and the stars.
It's the
Columbo. Welcome to the SS Columboat, maybe a series where I'll be talking about Columbo, which is maybe not super surprising in the current climate of media discussion and analysis, because unbeknownst to me, apparently Columbo really saw like a big resurgence, I guess we could call it, during the pandemic. Apparently a lot of people were just looking for stuff to watch, and plenty of those people happened to look backwards into television history. Found Columbo, which is available through a huge number of streaming services, basically, as long as you're willing to put up with ads. I don't know, more people have just become aware of the series, have really fallen in love with it, and I'm technically one of those people, even though I really only came across it or started to delve into it more just a few months ago. There is potential, I think, to do a whole series of videos just about specific episodes of Columbo that I really enjoy, episodes that highlight some of the stuff that I enjoy the most about the show, but just for today, and also as a way to see whether or not it's even possible for me to use clips from the show at all based on copyright claims and blocks and such, I just want to make a more general video sort of introducing some of the aspects of the show that I really love. And again, I haven't spent all that much time with it, and as plenty of other people have pointed out, this is originally a show from the 70s and then into the 80s. Someone watching it now is no doubt going to miss out on certain bits of cultural context, certain aspects of just filmmaking or television production from that era that don't really align with more contemporary methods. So there is some of that happening and certain things that I just won't be able to speak to. But in terms of what I like about it, I can speak to that no problem. And that's exactly what I want to get into today. Now, going into Columbo, I mean, obviously I've heard the name. It's an incredibly famous TV show, but growing up I was vaguely aware of it. But for the most part in my brain, I lumped it in with other shows that I considered to be of a similar genre and of a similar level of like historical mustiness. Do you know what I mean? Like Kojak, Monk, even though that was a good while later. Just plenty of like crime and detective TV shows that, at least my impression of them was that they were really outdated, that they wouldn't be especially fun to watch. And for the longest time, that was my impression of Columbo, having never really even seen a single episode. I just kind of felt that way about it. I had that kind of a hunch, and it was completely incorrect. Really, one of the first things that sort of motivated me to actually dive in and watch some episodes of the show is that I was already familiar with some of Peter Falk's work. More specifically, I had seen him in a number of movies from John Cassavetes. Cassavetes is an extremely famous indie filmmaker doing stuff in the 60s and 70s and 80s. He's a whole other discussion. Lots of other videos could be made about his work. But he and Peter Falk were personal friends. They just kind of hung out together. And Peter Falk in general, I mean, it seems really obvious to say, and I don't want to overemphasize this point, Peter Falk is amazing in Columbo. He's amazing in a lot of his roles, but specifically as this character, he has just a really great understanding of who this character is, what is appealing about this character, and the execution is basically flawless, at least from my somewhat ignorant perspective on the finer details of acting and performance. It's just an extremely likable character, period. Columbo's just fun to be around, and this is something that Peter Falk himself clearly knows, and even just the writing staff of the show knows this 100% as well, because it comes up in the show all the time. Just a bunch of characters will comment on the fact that, like, oh, there's just something really charming about you, Columbo. There's something that makes it fun to hang out with you, and I think that's a similar feeling among a lot of viewers. It's just this character is so solid and so appealing, but at the same time still delivers every single time, every single episode in terms of doing actual detective work, and as the show progresses, doing some really like flashy, intricate finales that are worthy of television. television. And at least in my opinion, the character of Columbo, in a way, he does sort of reference and homage some other like noir fiction detectives of the past. And we've seen a lot of iterations of this sort of grizzled detective character who is going to get the job done. They're probably going to step outside the rules a bit. They're really smart, they're very capable, and they're going to accomplish their goals. Noir fiction is another giant topic I can't cover today in any real detail, but I did want to give one quick note here, and that's how it feels like the character of Columbo is in a lot of ways maybe a slight subversion, or potentially from a different perspective, an expansion of noir archetypes. There's a great summary of noir fiction that Norman Klein delivers in this excellent book, History of Forgetting, which is about perception of Los Angeles, erasure within Los Angeles. It's sort of complicated, but it's a very good book. Anyway, at one point he summarizes noir as white male panic. So specifically, if we're looking back to really early detective stuff, the old Philip Marlowe paperback books, things like that, you almost always have a white male detective character who's either down on their luck or is willing to place themselves in sort of the seedy underbelly, usually of a city, and that seedy underbelly, at least in general terms, is typically coded or just straight up depicted as like very non-white, foreign in a lot of cases, and this is just, these are the parts of town where bad things happen, but here's our guy who, though he's been certainly roughed up by that kind of environment, he's sort of the shining example of, he's gonna make things right, he is delivering justice, and he's gonna see through all the problems and figure out what's going wrong. With that interpretation of noir in mind, Columbo, the show, and the character feel like a pretty stark contrast, because in terms of the murderers, the villains of each episode, they are almost exclusively white, very wealthy, in certain cases extremely wealthy, and typically in positions of power. So right away, in terms of our murderers and victims, we have like upper crust of society, basically. It's all based in Los Angeles, of course. And yeah, a lot of these villains, they're not living in like the somewhat grimy, parts of downtown. They're not in East LA, etc. They're in like Beverly Hills, they're in the Hollywood Hills, they're in like Brentwood, the Valley, Malibu, these incredibly exclusive, very wealthy neighborhoods. And Columbo himself is absolutely positioned as just the everyman, at least in terms of his surface level appearance, his demeanor, the way that he conducts conversations with people. In all of those senses, he is extremely average. He's incredibly normal. He's the person you're supposed to relate to, and he's also just a good guy. We know that he's motivated by positive goals, positive aims. You don't get the sense that he's caught up in like personal vendettas. So even just in terms of his personality and the people that he's going after, he's already quite separate from a lot of the noir detectives we've seen over decades and decades of, iterations of that genre. But at the same time, that sort of everyman identity it's added on to with this sort of stealth element of the character, and that's his status as like an extremely prominent homicide detective within the LAPD. He's also just incredibly intelligent and incredibly capable at his work, and I think Peter Falk actually sums up sort of the two core elements of this character extremely well in this interview from, I think, sometime in the 90s.
What originally struck me is how interesting it would be to be a very average person, except for one thing. You happen to be the greatest homicide detective in the world.
So on multiple fronts, the show, Columbo, and the character of Columbo give us just a sense of, a contrast, difference from plenty of other noir fiction, detective television shows, murder mysteries, things like that. Also, another potential subversion, at least for the time, is that we see the murder at the beginning of each episode. We might even have 20 or 30 minutes before we actually wind up with Columbo. And as a result, the viewer doesn't have that normal element of excitement that they would have with a bunch of other murder mystery type of content fiction, which is that they're also trying to figure out who done it. No, we know from the outset who it is. We know who the bad guy is, and we know almost all of the details of how they did it, except for a few episodes where they hide some of those elements. And I think that's a really fascinating element because in terms of storytelling and like just television drama, it adds a lot of dramatic irony. And basically dramatic irony is a situation where the member of the audience already has a crucial piece of information that one or more characters on screen don't have. This is something that Hitchcock used all the time, and I think he even described dramatic irony by saying, oh, it's when the audience knows that there's a bomb under the table, but the characters don't. It adds a great sense of tension. It might even lead to a situation where you're like yelling at the screen. It seems so obvious to you because you have all of that information, but you have to kind of wait for the characters on screen to sort of catch up, find all of those small details. And of course, it's extremely satisfying as Columbo sort of walks along the path. He finds one little detail at a time, and then slowly everything starts to come together with all the different puzzle pieces. However, and I've already been talking about the character of Columbo a whole lot, but I think this is extremely important to, stipulate. It's really important for me to make clear an overemphasis of the importance of the Columbo character and of Peter Falk's performance runs the risk of devaluing or distracting from a lot of the other excellent components of this show. As I mentioned at the top, I was not expecting to enjoy the show. I was not expecting it to feel, all that entertaining. I thought it would feel old and musty and sort of out of touch. And sometimes with older television shows, they can feel kind of constrictive to me and almost claustrophobic because they just seem so small in scope and the execution is kind of janky from a modern perspective, and I just don't enjoy watching them at all. But here in Columbo, certainly over the first 5-6 seasons, I would say, there's some really fantastic filmmaking happening, just in terms of cinematography, shot selection, camera moves, framing. This show gives a great sense of space when it needs to. It has some lovely establishing shots for a lot of our locations. In general, the location scouting is excellent. We get some really fantastic homes here in the LA area, or just settings in or around LA. Everything looks lovely in terms of color grading and stuff. I mean, it had to have been shot on film, obviously, at the time. It looks great. It's generally lower contrast, I would say, than a lot of contemporary filmmaking. And on top of the great filmmaking, we have some wonderful surrounding performances. We have a ton of actors who reprise specific roles on the show, or they will play different roles across different episodes. There's a lot of other incredibly impressive stuff happening here, and so I think that talking way too much about just the character of Columbo and Peter Falk's performance, can potentially get in the way of talking about all the other incredible work that's being done on the show. Beyond all this analytical stuff and sort of the finer details, this is just a really fun show to watch. It's really comfortable. It's incredibly narratively satisfying. It also uses what might now be considered a slightly old-fashioned approach to television storytelling, which is that it has one-off episodes. In other words, there's a particular story arc introduced at the beginning of each episode, and it's completely resolved in a satisfying way by the end of the episode. Nowadays, plenty of television shows, streaming or otherwise, use a format where you get smaller bits of a larger story, but for the most part, it's about continuing through this massive storyline where the stakes continually raise, and it can make for a very stressful viewing experience if you're not able to immediately binge and watch all the rest of the episodes. Eventually, the big story arc will be completed. And this is something that I touched on in my video on Craig of the Creek and Star Trek TNG. That first structure of just standalone one-off episodes can feel very comfortable. It can make for extremely comfortable viewing experiences, specifically because it delivers tension and release within a smaller window of time. You're not feeling that incredible narrative tension over a period of multiple hours. No, you feel it for a stretch of an entire episode. With Columbo, that could be between 45 minutes and like an hour and a half. Tons of episodes are like feature length, which is kind of crazy. Even though it's considered somewhat old hat nowadays, except for like, certain animated shows and things like that, it still works very well. And yes, this structure also relies extremely heavily on a specific formula. In fact, watching different episodes of Columbo, you will be able to tell which scene is going to happen next, just because the order, the formula is so tight and so specific that it can really just kind of feel like fill in the blank, like change the names around from episode to episode. But that really doesn't bother me all that much because it's still delivering on these other fronts, on so many other fronts. But honestly, I think that's probably where I should stop for the moment. The big headline here is that if you haven't seen Columbo at all so far, just go ahead and try it out. Thankfully, they do have a pretty substantial presence here, even just on YouTube. They upload a lot of clips. They'll upload like 12-minute cut downs of full episodes if you just want to get a taste of what the storylines are like. But I do think there's a lot of value in watching a full unedited episode. And hey, you might not like it at all. You might think it's kind of annoying or that the formula is just too overbearing. But plenty of other people have continued to find a lot of value in the show, even outside of historical context, even like decades after the fact. It's kind of surprising to me, but it's the best kind of surprise, where you take a gamble on a new media property or something that you're not super familiar with, and it turns out to be one of your new favorites. Here's hoping that other people can have a similar experience there. But honestly, in the meantime, I'm gonna see how this video does, see whether it's viable to do some more in the series. But for now, I'll just say thanks for stopping by.